Oh my god. Wow. I had a lot of people piss me off today. A lot. It's amazing how cruel and sadistic people can be. Amazing. You know, I might have a rough personality, but God, people are amazing. By that I mean amazingly bad. My God. Whoa. Wow, today's a day from hell. I'll edit out that later. Maybe I won't. I never edit anything, right? No, actually I do edit some things. Sometimes, rarely. Bokeh, specifically, classified 5 different types, and it can be an interfit, a crossover, excuse me, between those two, or a hybridization of the two. People always think of bokeh as the image circle that is rendered, and that's understandable. When we're referring to bokeh, we're not specifically referring about the specular circles, whether they be soap bubble bokeh, or onion ring bokeh, or cat's eye bokeh. No, we're actually talking about just the damn background. Let's just forget the circles, okay? Let's forget the circles. You could have identical images, like several different lenses, for example, and I have basically all of them. 85mm 1/8. 85mm 1/4 is like, well, they're both shot at 85mm 1/4 on full frame camera. Let's ignore the image circles, the specular highlights of the out of focus elements like Christmas tree lights. Let's just talk about the actual background itself, the out of focus elements. We're not talking about foreground bokeh either. However, we would be, but that's not seen in too many images people ever take notice of. 5 different types: ethereal, rich, angelic abstract, harsh, and framing. And of course, like I said, there are crossovers between these 5. For example, in various different 85mm, one thing specific, let's talk about ethereal. It's found in like Tamron's 45mm 1/8, most of Sigma's lenses, and also high element count lenses. This ethereal bokeh, what am I referring to? Soft, it's often washed out, it's very pastel and light toned. I refer to it as a muted aesthetic of bokeh. Obviously I'm referring to the out of focus background. The muted aesthetic bokeh. You can call it whatever you want. I've just called it ethereal. It is often much lighter relative to its cousins, shot at the exact same exposure, exact same EV range, even whether the dynamic range is off due to the element count and how the actual image is dropped onto the sensor. It is lighter. So it's soft, washed out, pastel, light toned. You know exactly what I'm referring to. This is also found on most 70 to 202/8, the ethereal bokeh, which people love, and that's understandable. Another type is rarely seen now. I don't say rarely, but far less frequently, is a rich bokeh. This is often like this. Here's a great example. The 55mm 1/2. It's contrasty, rich, saturated, soupy. Is very saturated. We're talking about like a low element count prime lens, typically too. We were talking about lenses that have a moderately significant amount of chromatic aberration. Many of Zeiss's lenses, like their 100mm, their sonars, the planars, the 50mm 1/4 planars, like this other lens sitting on this Fuji X-T2, the 105mm f1.8 5-element lens, say AIS Nikkor. It has really rich, dark, soupy, contrasty, rich, saturated bokeh. Like I said, you're talking about referring to several different lenses, say the exact same focal and the exact same aperture and the exact same exposure, in non-reference to the bokeh balls, as is commonly connoted. Just the out-of-focus aesthetic of how the lenses render the bokeh of that composition of the shot. Angelic abstract. These are oddball lenses. A lot of them are older, a simpler design, like a Cook triplet. The Trioplan, like the Trioplan 100mm f2.8. It's watercolory. It's impressionistic. It is an interference aesthetic, where it's just like melting watercolors. It's and we're not talking about the actual soap bubble bokeh, which of course is part of the background out of focus specular elements of the lens and actually how it renders. But this angelic abstract the Trioplan, the Rekinans, what are some others? Pentagons, the Pentacon 50mm f1.8. Many of these lenses are very simple in design and older, usually. Either that or an older design, even if they're not an older lens. Fourth, be a framing bokeh. Framing bokeh, where we're talking about swirly, distorted, orchestrated, and coherent, out of focus framing of the shot. Like one of the great things, like the Biotar, the Biotar, the 75mm f1.5. Of course, the copy of that, well, it is 85, is still a copy of that. The 85mm f1.5 Helios. Even though it's a soft lens with not so hot resolution, it makes this incredible framing swirly bokeh, or you can say washing machine bokeh, that actually frames the subject. The out of focus elements are completely in line with framing the subject matter that you're actually shooting. So you actually use these lenses to their advantages, and people will often talk about how distracting it is, but if you know how to use a lens correctly, like it's hard to learn how to correctly use a fisheye. People incorrectly use fisheyes. They point them in the wrong direction. You know, you can make the most beautiful woman look like a dog, like a circus freak dog. If you actually know how to use the lens, like on a fisheye lens, and this is not the sort of framing that I'm talking about, but you know, bend to the curvature of you know, the way that element, that lens, not the element, but how the lens actually renders the composition, so you can bend a person's body to that curvature. You have to actually know how to use these lenses, and part of that is knowing how each specific lens renders the bokeh uniquely. I call that a framing bokeh, or as complementary aesthetic, where the background used by the skillful photographer, knowing what the lens does, is that everything is swirled around a central subject matter, that you use that. It doesn't have to be dead center with everything swirling around that. You can offset it, but it still leads to the aesthetic of everything is warping towards the subject matter that you're shooting. So as a complementary aesthetic. The fifth would be, of course, the nastiest, would be harsh bokeh. It's busy, it's too defined, it's mushy, it's smeared and obtrusive. It's like no matter what background you stick behind a person, the bokeh is screaming like stray cats in a washing machine, is an old southern saying. That sounds horrible, but it's just a saying. It's like something so noisy and horrific, it doesn't matter what's going on. It's just bleeding into anything that you want to be. So, and we're not talking about, like I said, the specular highlights. We're actually just talking about the out-of-focus background. So it's busy and defined and mushy. So it's an unharmonious aesthetic. So we have muted aesthetic, high gain, or flamboyant aesthetic, which would be the rich bokeh, like out of a lens like this, typically older lenses, so I call it high gain or flamboyant aesthetic. We have angelic abstract bokeh, or the interference aesthetic, where the out of focus is impressionistic, watercolored, it's ethereal, and it may not be for everybody, and certainly not for everything, but if you use it correctly in the correct situation, it just makes them. That's the reason why I have that damn Trioplan 100mm 2.8. Framing bokeh, like the swirly bokeh off the Helios lenses and some of the Pentacon lenses and some of the older low element, typical of 50mm, 55mm lenses, so it's a complementary aesthetic. So we have ethereal, rich, high contrasty, rich and saturated, angelic, abstract, harsh, we think we all know what that means, and framing bokeh. And like I said, there are sometimes, depending on the lens, bleed over where two of these are mated up. You find both of them in the exact same lens. But this is the case where people, the reason for making this video is people think, well, this lens has got good bokeh. It's like, well, we have to define that a little bit better. We could talk about two radically different renderings aesthetically on the out-of-focus elements on two, like, say, 85mm 1.4s. The out-of-focus elements are equally out of focus in both compositions, and yet it is the case that they are rendered radically different. I mean, the ethereal bokeh out of an 85 1.4 from like the Zeiss planar is radically different than the equally out of focus and Nikkor 85 1.4G, which is It's actually a little bit harsh. Actually, I was referring to the 8514D Nikkor, excuse me. I was referring to the Zeiss 14. So many lenses out there. I got hundreds of lenses, hundreds and hundreds of lenses in my head. The 8514 planar Zeiss versus the 8514D Nikkor, which is rich and contrasty and saturated and soupy. Whereas like the 8514G Nikkor is ethereal. It's soft and washed out and pasteled and light toned. And one is not superior to the other. Since we're talking about the aesthetic that you want, you know, there is no right answer. However, there is a right answer when it comes to micro contrast if that's what you want. And then you have to know what lens does that best. By the way, here's a little side trick. It's not a trick. It is the case that any lens that renders an ethereal or soft, washed out pastel, light toned, or muted aesthetic background is not a lens that does good at black and white micro contrast. All the lenses that render good micro contrast have a rich or high gain flamboyant aesthetic, which is contrasty, rich and saturated and soupy. Those are the high micro contrast lenses. And there's a reason for that, but it'll take a long time to go into. So I hope this video was entertaining. Well, I mean entertaining. It's supposed to be educational. Not always entertaining, but educational. It's always best if it's educational and entertaining, right? Too much coffee in my system. Thank you so much for watching. If you like these videos, you can click the link below. Tell me to jump off a cliff. Whatever makes you happy. I hope I made you happy. If I didn't make you happy, I hope I gave you something to think about, because people often don't think about this sort of stuff. Probably because they're busy with their normal lives, maybe. Thanks for watching. Bye.